Hola, Animigos, and welcome to Keyframers, the animated collaborative coding live stream where we bring imaginative user interfaces to life. I'm your host, Stephen Shaw.
And I'm your host, David Khourshid.
And today we are joined by a new coding compadre, animation amigo, Boolean buddy, Zach Saucier. Is that how you say the last name?
It varies. When we're in the South, it's Saucier. When we're in pretty much anywhere else, it's Saucier.
Saucier.
Oh wow, we were
you can just call me Saucy if you want.
Saucy. I like it.
Saucy Zach Saucy. Well, Zach Saucy Saucier, however, Saucy Zach is an animation aficionado. He's pretty much just like us. He's written and talked about web animations, SVG animations, WebGL effects, just like a whole ton of things. And so it should come as little surprise that he's one of the senior developers over at GreenSock. So we're really excited to have him on the show.
Yes. You can find him on Twitter as at Zach Saucier, spelled exactly how it sounds. And learn more about all of his projects at zachsaucier.com. Jack Saucier. Let's see here. Yeah. So you can get a feel for how it's spelled. There you go. I've got your personal site up there. It's a really cool site, by the way.
Thank you.
A lot of little touches to it.
Yeah. As always, it's old and needs a refresh, but
I wouldn't expect anything less. Yeah, that's always how it goes. But yeah, welcome, Zach. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So today we kind of were talking about some different things that we wanted to do, some different things to show off. Obviously, GreenSock's a big deal in terms of web animation. Like, there's just so much about it that powers a lot of the web and informs the way that web developers animate on the web. So we wanted to kind of get into that a little bit and wanted to do an animation that would kind of show off some of that. So this is one that we talked about a little bit beforehand. La Growth Machine, an unused concept, kind of a landing page that you might see on a typical startup or app website, yeah, there's 3D elements to it. We'll be using CSS 3D, not like a full 3D rendering engine, because that's a whole nother episode. But yeah, anything y'all particularly notice about this animation, or you think is going to be a challenge before we get into it?
Well, at the end of the animation, it says, "You're not ready for this," and we're not. But you know what? That's the whole thing of the entire episode. We were telling Zach that one of the requirements for being on the show is you have to make a mistake so that everyone knows that you're human.
That's right.
So I feel like that's exactly what we're all going to do today, and we're going to have fun doing it.
Yes. Yeah, that's the important bit.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Zach? Anything in particular stand out on this animation to you?
So with the shot that you shared, there's a lot of aspects that you could pull out of this and create in a short time, but to do all of it in a short time would be very difficult.
Right.
If I were tasked with this as a developer, I would definitely have a conversation with whoever designed it to just be on the same page about, okay, which aspects are the really important ones here? Which ones can we focus on first, I guess?
And what can we pull off in an hour?
3D elements. Yeah, right. And so animating these 3D elements, I think, is what we're going to be focused on with a lot of our time today.
Yeah.
So how do we want to tackle this? Do we actually want to make it scroll based, or when I think of scroll based animations, I just immediately cower in fear. There's just so much that goes into scroll triggered animations. However, GreenSock, not talking about their last release, but the release before that, they recently released a scroll trigger plugin or something like that might help us out here, or however you want to tackle it.
Yeah, that's the really cool thing about it is with scroll trigger, you can create an animation that is just made of tweens and timelines with GSAP. and then attach a scroll trigger to it once you're done. You don't have to worry about it until you're finished animating everything the way that you want to exactly.
Yeah. We typically stray away from scroll animations. We have done some with just straight up CSS variables and have we used intersection observer, David?
I don't know, but I do want to say that one of our most popular animations was a scroll-based animation.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a difficult thing to do performantly. So I'm really interested to see, you know, scroll magic and play around with that. If we are able to get that integrated here. But yeah, you should definitely check out the new scroll trigger plugin. And there's also another new plugin. Is that right?
Yeah, the newest plugin that GSAP has is one called the Flip plugin, which uses the flip animation technique, which you guys have covered in the past, to animate really between two states dynamically. So you set up the first state and then the second state, and then the Flip plugin will kind of figure out, okay, what do I need to animate in terms of transitioning from that first state's position to the second state. And it handles a lot of edge cases. So if you've ever tried to do that sort of thing before, one thing that's particularly difficult is like working with elements that are transformed, especially like a parent is transformed somewhere, and trying to accommodate for that without a tool like the Flip plugin is doable, but it'll definitely take a lot of time to figure out and be very tricky. So like all of GSAP's plugins, it's intended to save you time to where you can really focus on the animation and get your project done.
Yeah, I really like this little introduction demo on the plugin documentation. Got a nice little walkthrough of the Flip abbreviation.
Yeah,
there.
Thank you to you guys for the core of that as well.
Yeah. No problem.
Well, yeah. So back to this animation, we probably won't need Flip too much here because, we'll probably be controlling most of it just directly with GSAP. But yeah, getting into it a little bit here, I did just base amount of setup here so we wouldn't have to spend too much time on scaffolding. We've got our page container. We've got this mockup that's kind of this little app dealio, and two different sections. So the background's fixed right now, and it makes the text really hard to read, but we'll fix all that with animation. And then CSS-wise, not too much already happening. There is just a little bit of setup for the 3D. Like I've already got it rotated just slightly, like the first state of it. But I had to do perspective on the HTML, and then the scrolling element had to be the body so that the fixed positioning was working right. But I think Scroll Trigger has some stuff for that built in, so we might get around that a little bit later on. But yeah, so David's going to town on some stuff already.
Yeah, so I just added a little something to make it easier to, think about the different states that the background mockup should be in. So I have this data state equals 2. And so now I'm rotating it on the y-axis just to see like, all right, once we end up in that state, here's what it should look like. Now, we might not end up using data states. I'm just using this for development purposes, just to, make sure we have everything styled correctly.
Yeah. Or
transformed correctly.
Yes, and we can translate it over as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, what we talked about in a couple episodes before is the order of transforms. They do matter. So, it might be good to, move that translate probably, to the front, and then, yep. So that makes it more predictable. So one of our little pro tips, pro as in we've run into this problem many times and, we figured it out, is that you should translate before you rotate, because figuring out translations after rotations yields some very unintuitive results. So if you want to translate X, but you're already rotated, it might be translating the other way or in a completely different direction. So just take care of your translates beforehand, unless you really know what you're doing.
Yeah, and that's one of the handy things about GSAP too, is that it kind of standardizes those transforms. So it creates it in an intuitive way, which in a lot of cases is beneficial. In cases like this, we might not actually want that, because we might want a little bit more fine control depending on how we want the 3D effects to come out. But that is one of the I would say benefits of GSAP, is that it standardizes that, so you don't have to think about it as much.
Right. Yeah, and that's awesome. One of the things that I do like about GSAP actually is that it basically I don't want to use the word transform, we're going to get convoluted here, but it takes each element and it basically makes their representation as a transform matrix. And so it doesn't think about, oh, how much to the left and top is it? Where is it rotated? It's like, no. Here's the matrix. We're going to put the matrix directly on the like style of the of each of the elements, and that's what we're going to animate. And so yeah, I think it makes things a lot more intuitive than trying to animate different things, like deal with Y, X. But obviously transform matrices are not really human readable. Like I've tried to learn them so many times, and after a few hours I just forget what the matrices really mean.
Yeah, if you've never seen CSS transform matrix, it gets bonkers, and like real math representations of matrices are even more bonkers. So yeah, it gets out there. So GSAP does a good job helping with a lot of that, normalizing that. That's definitely a handy thing to do. But so we basically have our two states. So if we toggle here at the top, just data state 1. We've got our first section kind of area. If I change that over to 2, that's what it's going to look like for section 2. So let's get into how to actually bring this to life. So one thing I didn't do was add GSAP in here. But if we go to the JavaScript settings and you type in GSAP, it's a really quick way to get GSAP and any necessary plugins added. I think we have a scroll trigger in here. Yep. Scroll trigger's ready to go in there as well. So these just add them as external dependencies there. And Jack in the chat's correcting our CSS talk. In GSAP 3, switched away from matrices so that we could accommodate various units, but we stick to matrix stuff for SVGs. And
right.
Yeah, that's a whole nother ball game with SVGs and transforms.
Yeah, that was something that I asked a long time about. So just to give you a little background on me, like I've always been curious about GreenSock, never really used it in all my years of animation, and I've just been that annoying person asking so many questions about it. And I remember, and maybe Zach, you could answer this, because I'm sure that there's an answer for this, but one of the questions that I did ask back then was, how do you animate to some relative unit, like a viewport, 1 VW, 1 VH, or something like that? Like in the past, I guess before CSS variables, you would actually create a dummy element, size that up to 1 VW, 1 VH, and then measure that using get bounding client rect, and then use that measurement. But I'm sure that it's a different thing with GSAP now.
Right, especially as the browser support for viewport units and things like that has increased. With that, GSAP 3 supports all of those units that you can use in CSS right out of the box. So to animate a element, say 1 or 10 viewport widths to the right, you just say X and then colon parentheses 10 VW. So it's very straightforward. And that's part of the reason why we moved away from matrices with GSAP 3 last year. Well, 2 years ago now, 2019.
So my information's old. I thought it was all matrices still, but it makes sense that it's still for SVG. Trying to animate anything in SVG is just a huge pain. In fact, I remember having to do a client project, and one of the problems was that things that I expected to work in CSS land, like, oh, just move this to the left, just, scale this by 2. it gave you a completely different transform origin. So it would like show up in a completely different place, and it was completely just unintuitive. And yeah, so honestly, for that client project, I just straight up removed scale animations and just stuck with transform, because I guess transform or translates doesn't care about the transform origin.
Right.
Like Y means Y, X means X. So.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why several more prominent SVG creators and animators recommend GSAP for animating SVG specifically, because it kind of normalizes a lot of those cross-browser issues that you can run into.
Yeah, and there's a ton.
Yeah, always more than you think.
That alone is definitely a big reason to use GSAP if you've got any kind of SVG animation going on. It helps so much. So I linked that nice overview blog post about GSAP and SVG. That's really great.
Yeah, and a fun shout out. Cassie Evans is also creating, well, she already has. She's hosting a web animation workshop focused on SVG animation. So sign up for that.
I heard very good things about that that workshop. You should definitely check that out. I'll try and find the link for it. So in the JavaScript, now that we have GSAP added, I did just the silliest possible animation, just showing the basic syntax of like a GSAP animation, a basic tween here with GSAP.to. So we're taking this element page, that's just a selector. We could also pass in a query selector, so const L page equals document.query selector page. Yeah. We can pass that in directly. It can be an array of elements also, right? And then these are the properties. So there are animation properties like the duration, the easing, and all of those, and the properties of the element that we want to animate. So X is short for translate X. There's Y for translate Y, and scale X, right? Is scale X, scale Y. There's also a property specifically for percents. So you could say X% and then 10 or something, or you could do the same with Y. But yeah, that's the core of it. Yes.
That's actually really handy because it allows you to combine like pixel units with percentages and things like that.
Right.
But you could also put your percent in the X property if you really wanted to.
Yeah. Hey, that's good to know. Yeah, that saves some manual calculation for sure. But yeah, so if we were gonna get started with just doing this kind of first part here, so the supercharger lead generation with like the 3D pop out into the just like roads and driverless cars section or whatever. Let's forget scroll. Let's forget anything else. Like how would you get started just animating that mock-up from that tilted perspective to the kind of 3D pop out setup?
I would probably do it actually pretty similar to the way David set things up with the second state of having these properties and values that we have where we're setting up the end state, because when you know the end variables, it's really pretty easy to animate there. So thank you, David, for setting things up in that way. It looks like you've already gotten some
pseudo random values.
Yeah, you also some translation in the Z direction, which is good and important to have. Yeah, it's nice to have a little bit more. Since we need to translate in the Z direction, it might actually be a good use case to animate CSS variables with GSAP. And so we can do that.
Oh, awesome. I remember when I first saw this in GSAP, I was extremely excited that they had that CSS variable support, because that's pretty much all I use now, for dynamic styling.
Yeah, and it works great since you've already set things up in this way. In GSAP, all we need to do is create a new tween that targets the same selector as the variable that we want to use. What is that for you?
So I'm just setting up our query selectors. So we've got mockup, const app, mockup. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we just use L as a fun prefix to indicate element, but also it's like Spanish. So if we have multiple elements, we'll los or...
Yeah, you could think of it as Hungarian notation, but more Spanish than Hungarian.
And so the app parts, los app parts, document.query selector all. And this is not something that you typically need to do with GSAP. Like you can just target the selector manually. But when you're reusing a lot of the same selectors and things like that, it's best to kind of store them as these variables, so that GSAP's not having to do it each time, right? Okay, so would you set up a timeline here, or just a basic tween to start with?
Probably a timeline, since we're animating multiple things. Although we could use GSAP's built-in staggering with a single tween. So it kind of depends on exactly what type of animation you're wanting to create. So with this, it probably makes sense to have a timeline, because we're probably going to be doing multiple things.
Yeah.
So to do that, you just do GSAP, or well, you probably want to save it to a variable.
Yeah.
So yeah, TL is equal to GSAP.timeline. And then
as a
just
function call?
Yeah. Function call.
Lowercase like that?
Yep.
Okay.
Just like that.
And then TL.to.
Right. And so that attaches a tween to that timeline, wherever the endpoint currently is, which, since it's just created, it's at 0.
Right. Yeah. So timelines are another big advantage of GSAP. It's gonna allow you to coordinate multiple animations, trigger all sorts of things along the way, control multiple animations all together. It really makes things a lot simpler. All the times that you've seen us working with CSS coordination, this kind of eliminates all of that. So if we want to target a CSS variable, we can just target it like that. Is that correct?
Yes. So I haven't actually tried it with an inline style set for the like per element. It might work like that out of the box, but we're going to have to check.
Yeah. Oh, and let's see. Okay.
Because
so
you're animating this array
so
of element. Well, I guess it's technically a node list of elements. And so it's trying to set the...
It does.
Yeah,
it does work.
go.
Yeah.
Success.
That's awesome. Okay. But so right now we already have like the end variables we kind of want on there. So instead of using to, we can actually just say from, kind of like CSS keyframes. We can do from, and instead of doing 5, we do 0 there. And yep, there we go. Wait. Okay, David's messing with our CSS, so we're not seeing it as much.
Hold on, just give me a few seconds. There we go.
Okay.
And one other note here is that you don't actually have to pass in a string. You can pass in a number directly to that if you would like.
Oh, hey, yeah, that's helpful. All right.
Don't forget the comma though.
Yeah, that usually helps. All right.
There we go.
Very nice.
Now this makes a little bit more sense. Sorry about that.
Yeah. And one other note is one of the really handy things of GSAP, especially GSAP 3, is the defaults that are built in. So by default, tweens have a duration of 0.5 seconds. So you could completely remove the duration if you wanted to. Or if you wanted just to have a default changed for a particular timeline, you could pass in an object to the GSAP.timeline function call and just say defaults, and then pass into that another object and pass in whatever properties you want all of the tweens in that timeline to have as their default.
Nice.
Which is something that really, really saves time, especially if you're doing the same sorts of animations throughout a timeline.
Yeah. Hey, that's nice. And so another big advantage of GSAP is you're not limited to CSS easings. The property for that is still just ease, right?
Correct.
Ease. And then with GSAP 3, things kind of changed up. So how do you call the easings there?
So now we recommend that you use the condensed string form of eases. So in this case, you'd have some quotes and then say something like power1 dot out.
Dot out?
Actually don't, you don't need the ease out anymore, and you don't need the capitalization either. It's just simple to write, hopefully quick. And actually by default, power1.out is the default, so you wouldn't have to write it for one. But also, a secondary note is .out is also the default, so you could just say quotes power4, and it would be the same thing as quote power4.out.
Nice.
But if you wanted to change that to say an in-ease, then you would do power4.in instead.
Yeah. And what if you wanted to do in-out?
So it'd be camel case with the out. But yes.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
There we go. All right. So showing a little bit of how we're actually accomplishing this animation. So we're combining GSAP here with our CSS. So in here, David set up a 3D transform. So this is actually in 3D space. We can rotate things around, and we can play around with that in a moment. But with this transform translate Z, we actually have a CSS variable that we're referencing in there, and then we're using GSAP to animate that CSS variable. So this is a great way to integrate your JavaScript animation with your CSS, so that it can be an enhancement. It can be a controller for that, if you will. So that's really awesome.
Sure, and then let's do something a little bit more fun. Right now, all of our elements are moving, starting the same time and ending at the same time. So we could add a little stagger to this tween by just inside of our tween saying stagger, and then passing in a number that we want it to be separated by 0.1. Then each tween would start 0.1 seconds after the previous one.
Nice.
And so it'll automatically stagger out those using a single tween, which is nice. You could also pass in an object. So right now, or by default, I guess, the 0.1 would be equivalent to each 0.1, which means every 0.1 seconds start the next tween. But say you wanted all of the animations to start within a second instead, you could do something like amount, which is the total duration, and then pass in a larger number, usually like 1, which means I want all of these animations to start within a second of each other. Space them out.
Right. So that's the length of the array. Array.length divided by 1, essentially.
Right. Yes.
Or 1 divided by array length. Right. I always forget the order. Yeah, something there. Math.
1 divided by array length, but yes.
Yeah, and then each is essentially index times that value, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Okay. Yeah, I like that. That using the amount makes it a lot easier to coordinate, like when your end time is going to be, because if we know our duration is 3 and we're using a stagger of 1, it's going to end at 4 seconds, right? Right. So no matter how many items we have, so that's helpful.
Yep.
Awesome.
There's also more complicated staggers, especially if you have like a DOM layout that is, say, a grid. You can do some really complicated and things really easily with staggers, but we won't get into that today, probably.
Yeah, I love the new stagger functionality. The grid stagger is super cool. That I'd love to mess around with that on the stream at one point. Okay, so we've got that, but this is happening at the same time as the app, like actually rotating. So how would you like to handle that? Where would we?
So with that, we're going to add another tween to our timeline that's affecting, instead of all of our parts, we're going to affect the whole container, which I believe is the app mockup, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yeah, if the CSS, one thing that is probably good to note is that when you write your transforms for elements in CSS, so in JavaScript, if you try and get those values, you can't really get the exact values in all cases. So and oftentimes it's definitely best practice to set all of your transforms in GSAP for elements that you want to transform with GSAP. So that way GSAP has knowledge of, okay, you're animating exactly what these properties are, as opposed to, hey, I received this matrix, I have to try and parse it and figure out, maybe guess what your properties are. So in this case, with the mockup, or with the container especially, I'd say we should probably set the initial transform with GSAP as well. So maybe instead of setting our value in the CSS, or we could actually reset it with GSAP. Duplicate that would also be fine. Yeah. And so, if I'm not mistaken, the transform on the container is just a rotation, right?
Yeah. So yeah, in here, line 15, I'm just duplicating that, so we can go from to. Right? Is that still the?
Yes, you can use from to. You need a second object.
Yeah, and then we'd go. So let's find it in here. This is where we ended up. So we can copy this over and pretty easily move our CSS values over to GSAP values just by adjusting a few things. Rotate X, rotate Y.
Yep, and you can actually drop the DEG if you'd like and just use numerical values again. But but you're welcome to do it either way.
David likes things to stay explicit.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, let's see.
Yes, I do.
So did that work there? Let's see. Let's see.
It might be good in general. I like to initialize the values, the same values in your from vars and your to vars. Have just rotate X there, which is fine. GSAP will start with a default of 0, but we might want to be more explicit there since David likes being explicit.
I do. Not language wise, but just,
right.
Yes.
Value wise.
Right.
Yeah.
And so by default, our tweens here are being sequenced, which is generally what you wanted to happen in a timeline. The mockup, I don't believe, is sequenced at least that extremely. So it might be a time when we should use the position parameter for our tweens. Mm-hmm. So in a timeline tween like what we have here, in the first tween, the from to tween, we have currently 3 parameters being the target, the from vars, and then the to vars. We could add a 4th element to that if we wanted to, but really we don't need to since it's the first tween in the timeline. So in the second tween that we currently have 2 parameters being passed in, the target and then the from vars. So we can pass in a 3rd parameter to that, and that will be our position parameter, which arranges our tween in the timeline so that we have more control. So in this case, if we wanted to start at the beginning, you could just do comma and then 0. Or if you wanted to be more fancy, there are more complicated, but still simple to use selectors for. Well, I guess selectors might not be the right word, but if you replaced with parentheses, or not parentheses, quotes, and then a less than sign, that will put that tween at the beginning of the previous tween, which is a really handy feature, especially say this tween before was somewhere further down in your timeline and you don't have the exact duration of like where it starts in your timeline. That'll just say, hey, look at the previous tween, start there, which is a handy feature. And there's a couple other things like that, which you can read about in our position parameter posts that we have to learn all about that.
That's awesome. Yeah, that can. What's the easiest way to add in the GSAP dev tools?
So I believe it's accessible through the CodePen import settings.
Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, so
So
GSAP
you can
DevTools.
include
If
it
you've
there.
never seen this before, this is a really cool way to visualize. So how do we initialize that? GSAP.
You would type gsdevtools.create.
And pass in RTL.
So you want to pass in an object, and inside of that object, you say animation, and then you pass in your TL if you wanted to. Technically, GS DevTools is smart enough to look for an animation on the page, but there's some cases where that might not work, especially if you have like multiple animations. It's like, well, which one do I choose? Because it can't visualize everything at the same time. So I would recommend including the object.
Is GS DevTools all lowercase?
No. So it's capital GSD and then capital T as well.
Okay.
Yeah. There we go. Now we have a timeline to scrub through our animation, which can be very handy.
Yeah, this is a real advantage here of GSAP is being able to scrub like this. Now, DevTools have gotten a lot better with CSS animations and like being able to kind of do this kind of scrubbing from just regular browser DevTools. But it can be a little cumbersome to do that because you've got to like record the animation first, and then playback can be a little squirrely.
Yeah.
So this
some handy features just to note them. So you can change, like you can drag the green and the red little markers to focus in on a piece of your timeline or animation, I guess, that you're focused on. And there are other features that are quite handy, like going to a label and things like that. But again, you can read about all of those features if you'd like to.
Yeah. That's just super helpful being able to scrub through as we build this out. Okay, so we've got the basics of the animation. I see David's doing some work in there trying to get shadows and all that kind of added
just
in.
Being fancy. Yep.
Yeah. And I saw you making comments about green socks. I do actually have green on my socks right now. That was purely coincidental. I promise. Okay. So, all right. So if we wanted to now tie this animation to scroll, how would we approach that? We're gonna need our sections, right? Our section elements of the content to trigger.
That would probably be helpful.
Okay.
Probably be helpful. But what I would recommend first is probably disabling the DevTools, because we don't want to have conflict between what's controlling the animation. So you can just comment out those lines, maybe.
Absolutely. Section,
now, the one of the really handy things is, like I said, you create your animation, you have this work, and you're like, oh, this is cool, but I need it to work with the scroll position. It's super, super easy with scroll trigger. So as long as you have it included, which I believe you include already, you can just use the parameters of the animation that you want to use. So in this case, we have a timeline. We're going to use the timeline. So inside of the timeline object that we already have with defaults, create a new line, say scroll trigger with a lowercase s, capital T. Yeah, there you go. Create an object, need a comma. And then inside of that, you do your scroll trigger properties. So in this case, you pretty much always want a trigger element, which says which element reference do you want to use as for your starting positions and end positions by default. So in this case, we could use a few different things. It could be the first section and then you use the bottom of it, or it could be the second section and use the very top of it. So you have some kind of freedom as for what do you want, which elements you want to use to trigger the animation, or you could use the document body itself if you wanted to. There's a lot of options here, but after you have your trigger, by default, it's going to play the entire animation from when the start position is reached. So by default, the start position for a scroll trigger is, there's a shorthand to make it easier. The default, if you say, or for the start property, which you can write, is top bottom, which means when this element, when the top of this, there's a space and a lowercase b, sorry, 2 words.
CSS style.
Right. This means when the top of the element reaches the bottom of your viewport, it's going to start.
Gotcha.
And so that's the default value. If we wanted to change that, like in this case, it might make sense to say bottom, or something like that. When the bottom of the element reaches the bottom of the viewport, we want things to start. So I believe you might need, I guess it depends on your viewport size and how the section is sized.
It doesn't seem to be triggering that for me. We do center bottom, maybe. There we go.
And another really handy thing is you can add, I'll just add it, markers, true, and then it will show us where the start and end positions are, which is especially handy for development. But you definitely want to remove those when you push your website live. I have known people, I won't call names, but I have known people to leave them in production. So now we have our start position, and like I said, by default, this will play the entire animation at one time. There's a very handy property where if you don't want that to happen, you want it to gradually go through as the user is scrolling so that the scroll position controls everything for that animation. You can just say comma and then scrub true. And this will make it to where the animation is scrubbed through. But we also have to change the end position here because I guess not with top bottom, but depending on you don't want your start and end positions to be the same if you have a scrub, because then it will just jump. You'll reach that position from the beginning state to the end state, which is not an animation. You don't want that. So make sure your start and end positions are different, and then what scroll trigger will do now, since it has a scrub, is it will take that start position and the end position. It'll figure out how far that distance is, and then it will progress through the progress of your timeline in the same ratio as the distance that you're covering between the start and end positions. So that's super handy.
Yeah, and if you've never done scroll triggered animations before, like it really gets tricky, like trying to figure out the best spot to trigger things and like how long to trigger them and all that. Like there's a whole feel to it that you really have to build up. But this is a pretty solid approach to just know, like, based on this element, I want it to start when the top of it hits the bottom of the viewport or the scrolling viewport, and end when the center of the element, so the center of our section 2 here, it's right there, reaches the bottom of the viewport. So that's awesome.
We spent a lot of time working through different iterations of the API, trying to figure out, okay, what feels right. And eventually we landed on this one, which has some negatives in some ways, but ultimately it was the best method that we found. So one other cool thing is right now with the scrub being true, it will be an exact update of the progress of our animation when the user is scrolling. So with my mouse, if I use the mouse wheel, it'll kind of jump to each state when the scroll bar updates. One way you can smooth that over is by using a numerical value for the scrub property instead. So if you did scrub 1, then it will take 1 second to update the values update the progress, I should say, instead of doing it immediately, which can smoothen it over, which is generally preferable if you're using scrub to have some sort of numerical value. With a magic mouse or something, you might not notice, but if you're using a more conventional mouse, it's definitely more noticeable.
Yeah, that helps a ton. That's awesome. Hey David, with the shadow setup that you've done, I'm getting a lot of like clipping in the 3D.
Yeah, so that was probably a failed experiment. I want to do some dynamic shadows.
I think it's close. It's really close. It's
Yeah.
just might need to start the like inner part out a little bit more.
Start
the white
inner part out.
the white of the inner. I'm not sure how you've got this set up. So let's see, at part inner, and then how are you doing the shadow?
The shadow is, I think it should be directly on the app part itself.
Okay.
Yeah, probably messed that up.
I'm not seeing it. It's all right. We'll fix that in post. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Jack in the chat saying it's like tweening the catch up to the scroll bar position. So like lerping.
Right.
If you recall from some of our previous episodes, we've done linear interpretation. What's the actual abbreviation, David? Do you remember?
LERP, yeah, man.
Linear extrapolation,
honestly,
relative
yeah,
to percentage or something.
Linear interpolation. I don't think LERP stands for that. Yeah.
Oh, is it just like the whatever it's called, smashing two words together? Linear interpolation.
I like to call those wombinations. Word combinations.
Love it.
Yes. Yeah, so that's awesome. So we've already got like the core of this animation happening. We're coordinating some pieces with the CSS, so that's really helpful. And then we've also got some elements of it that are going to be just controlled with the JavaScript, and that's fine. And this kind of animation is a progressive enhancement. It should be treated that way. If JavaScript doesn't load, it doesn't need to be a movie in the background. If the browsers, if you're on like a really small screen, like they don't need to see this animation either. So like you can do a lot of conditional stuff this way and make the experience a lot better. So that's a great way to integrate these animations.
Yeah. And there's on that note, there's a feature of Scroll Trigger called Match Media. It's kind of it's named that way because it reflects the normal media queries and match media that you might use outside of Scroll Trigger. But it's actually a wrapper outside of what you're creating. So instead of being a property inside of a specific Scroll Trigger, you would outside of the timeline, before the timeline, you would do scroll trigger.match media and then create call the function. I can link you to the documentation if you would like.
That's really cool.
Second. And so what the benefit of that is everything inside of the match media will be called inside of those media queries, and it will automatically handle the cleanup for you outside of those media queries. So if somebody starts on a small viewport and then resizes to a big viewport, it'll create it for you when that media breakpoint is reached. And same thing for the opposite. If you start with a big and go to a small and you want to get rid of it, it'll handle that automatically. So it's a really handy functionality, and you can have multiple breakpoints with different animations. Even if you say, like on mobile, you want to limit your animations to just a subset, you can do that.
That's awesome. Yeah, so we could completely hide this element unless it's visible. So let's see, is it GSAP.scrollTrigger or just scroll trigger directly?
Yeah, scroll trigger.matchMedia, okay. And then
So we could say max width, 600 pics. We could say L mockup.remove, and that doesn't work in all browsers, but that's a good quick way. So let's see, 600 pixels.
One note with that. So if you remove an element, it will remove it as you tell it to. But once you remove it, if say somebody started on the started on a small viewport, the element would be removed, which obviously you want. But then if they resize to a big one, because you removed it from the DOM,
right,
GSAP can't recover it. So it might not be what you want to happen in that specific case.
Sure.
But also with this, so my intention for bringing this up was, what might make more sense is if you have a min width of whatever value, and you put your entire timeline with your tweens inside of that function, then GSAP will handle the creation and cleanup of that for you. So you can literally just cut all of that timeline and paste it into that second function. And now GSAP will automatically clean up that timeline and scroll trigger when the breakpoint is reached, and create it back for you when necessary.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's very handy. And a quick side note, if you wanted to set a style property like that, you definitely can do it that way. But the more GSAP way would be to use a .set. So it would be GSAP.set, and then your target, and then you pass in an object that has display and then block. So it's a shorter way, especially if you're doing like multiple properties. It can get tiresome to write .set property, display, and then that every time. So as an alternative, you could set your properties with GSAP directly if you wanted to.
Right. GSAP.set, is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Okay. It's the same syntax as a tween, but it's essentially a zero duration tween. So
yeah.
Yeah, we have that under muscle memory. We're just like style.set property, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Which only comes after thousands of times of doing it. So I don't expect any normal developer to. I expect them to prefer .sets. That's just so much easier.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things, like with all of this, GSAP is a JavaScript library, and so integrating it with JavaScript frameworks or libraries like React and Vue and all that, like it becomes really easy to integrate things there. And so like if you were showing and hiding an element, you'd do it completely differently in React, most likely. But yeah, I like this approach, and the GSAP.set is super helpful for that. And I'm not using visibility hidden. A question in the chat was, why don't you set visibility to hidden instead of display? Display none essentially completely removes it from the flow. The browser's not going to try and render it. It's not going to worry about it at all. So for like a more limited device, like a mobile device, then that's just good to get it out of the flow completely. Okay, so yeah, we've got a scroll triggered animation. Can we add if it'll just take a few minutes. Could we add some split text in there? Because that's kind of part of this this animation.
Yeah, we can do that. So you want to include it as you included the other.
Right. So we'll look for GSAP split text. Second result right there. So that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And so we've got our timeline, and so right now our timeline is all controlled based on the second section. So we would probably need to add a separate timeline for the very first section, right? If we wanted to animate that one. But we can just focus on the second section for now. So let's say down here at the bottom, so we can do just another tl.from. And then how would you approach that?
So when you're using split text, you should first actually split the text, which essentially creates your extra div elements. So if you don't have them, like the whole purpose of split text, I guess, to give some backstory is as a developer, you want to be able to just write whatever you want to be able to write English. So say you wanted to animate each letter in your paragraph. You don't want to have to manually add, I'm going to add a div or a span around every single letter, because then, wait, the person just changed their paragraph to a new paragraph. I'm going to have to redo all that work or whatever. That's kind of a hassle. So, and it messes up it just makes your markup a bit more dirty, you might say, with a bunch of elements that are really there for style purposes. So to put that into the JavaScript, you can use something like split text, or there's another library called Splitting.js that does something similar, but has maybe a little bit more. They don't quite get as many edge cases, but in a lot of cases it works out well.
Quite a few more limitations, that's for sure.
To create your split text, you would say new split text, and then pass in your target. And by default, that'll split it by the lines, by the words, and the letters. And so if you just needed the lines, for example, you could pass in a second parameter as an object, and then say type, and then a colon, and then lines for just the lines. And that will take your element, it'll figure out how it's rendered, and it will put a new div around each line that you can then do whatever with. You could style it in a different way. You could add a class to it. You could animate it. A lot of times these days, a popular animation is to like reveal each line. And so you might split it twice. And on the parent split, you put overflow hidden, and then on the child one, you animate it in the Y direction. And so it like appears out of nowhere. That's a very common use case. And so in this shot, what exactly are they doing?
They're just kind of fading in, it looks like. So what we do is tl.from split.lines and animate it that way.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So you could use opacity, or you could use GSAP has a property called auto alpha, which will actually toggle the visibility as well if it's 0 or non-zero. And so that's pretty handy, because then you don't have to manually worry about changing the visibility. And so you could do from auto alpha 0, and then that animation also has a Y component to it. So you could use Y or Y% to animate in the Y direction as well.
Like that. All right, so this is going to be for our second section here. So when we scroll in, but it's triggering at the very beginning. We don't want it to trigger quite there. We want it to...
So there's a bunch of ways of doing relative offsets. You could, if you knew the exact numerical position, you could put that there. Good job using the staggers. You could use a numerical position. You could use another relative offset. So by default, like I said before, tweens and timelines will be sequenced after each other. And so knowing that, you can pass in a position parameter of some quotation marks and then minus equals some number, and then it will be relative to that default starting position. So if you did minus equals 1, it'll start 1 second before it normally, it would in sequence. So that might be a good choice for this case.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that works really well there. So yeah,
that's pretty cool how it goes not based on a fixed duration, but based on the, I don't know, like how far you actually, because I'm scrolling really slow and I'm seeing the text slowly make its way up there. That's pretty fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the relative offsets is something that's hugely beneficial for developer efficiency. I have a whole article of different tips of how you can be more efficient in writing it, but that's definitely one, is instead of hard coding all your values or percentages or whatever of, hey, I want this to start then, if you can use relative offsets, the more you can, the better. because if you update something earlier on, you don't have to update everything later,
Now I have to
that is a
ask,
pain.
do negative delays do the same thing?
Yes.
Awesome.
In most cases. So yeah, if you wanted to put a delay on the actual tween itself, that is valid. And GSAP does take that into account when positioning things. But we recommend using the position parameter because it has better capabilities. Like the different operators, like I mentioned, you can't use those inside of the delay property. I think that, to me, that's the main reason why I use it. But we do recommend using the position parameter.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we could do a similar sort of thing for the first section if we wanted to, right? Just to understand the scroll trigger aspect a little bit more. So let's split that first section, and we can just do a tween for this, right?
Right.
Tween.
Yeah, as long as you have the split, and then So if you want it to be on load, you don't want it to be attached to the same timeline.
Right.
So yeah, just a regular tween. Doing the split 1 dot lines.
Oh boy.
You change that.
I seem to have lost control of the browser at this point.
Uh-oh.
We are being attacked by ransomware.
Yeah, during a live stream.
Anyone have spare Bitcoin?
Please. Yeah, let me see if I can get back to it. Hold on. Technical difficulties. Don't worry.
Happens to the best of us.
It does. And
a good old refresh always does the trick.
Sometimes when my browser's frozen like this, it does not want to play nice with that.
Now we do want to mention that the cause of the freezing is not GreenSock, allegedly. But
no,
so we have not infiltrated your computer. Don't worry. We provide the source code so that you can check yourself. Don't worry.
Yeah. Exit out. Thank you. There we go. Get that closed. There we go. Okay. Sorry. I'll be back up and running here. There we go. All right. Hey, it's already working a little bit there, just because it's triggering right at the start. But if we wanted that to re-trigger on like on the scroll, like if you're scrolling back up, we would add our scroll trigger here. We'd add L first section, and we would. How would you recommend like setting up the start and end for that?
Yeah, good question. So we want the start position. It could be really anything that is before the, so you don't have to scroll. And so it could be, if you wanted to, you could just use like a number like -1, actually, just
straight
the
up.
-1, which is an exact scroll position, which means, so like if you put it in 100 or something, it'd be when you scroll 100 pixels, fire off, whatever. And so that would be an option. You don't actually need a trigger for that because it uses, it would use the default one of the body. I believe that should work. We also want to make sure and get rid of this because it's not in a timeline.
Yeah.
Scrub we don't want because that will be gradual. So yeah, without the scrub, it fires the animation. Probably don't need markers. Well, I guess you could leave markers. For the in position, that's also important for things like this. Depends on exactly what you want it to be. You could pass an exact value like you have. It could be, you probably want it to be larger than just 1 pixel, I guess. I would like for it to, appear right when you get there. And then when you scroll out and scroll back, like having it re-trigger. Okay. Yeah. One could be a valid value.
So you do 1 and scrub true.
if you want it to scrub, but then that whole animation is trying to fit within a 1 pixel distance.
Yeah,
which,
no problem.
With a scrub of 1 might work. Like if you had a numerical scrub, that's more acceptable, because then it progresses over that duration. One other option is if you didn't want to use a scrub, so say this was a timeline and you wanted to have more fine control over how things are appearing, then you might want to get rid of the scrub and instead use a property called toggle actions, which is camel case property in the object. And what toggle actions is like how do you want this animation to be controlled when it's entered, when it's left, when it's re-entered from the bottom, and when it's exited from the top? And so it is not an object, actually. It's a string. We considered an object form, but we ended up with a string because it ends up being less typing for a developer. So in that order that I just said, you can pass in keywords. So by default, the keywords are play, none, 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 which means when the scroll trigger is entered, it will play the animation, and the other ones say, don't do anything else. Just let it continue playing. And so by default, that works for any reveal animations, especially. So if we wanted this section to just stay there the whole time, the default of play none, none, none would be great because it plays it. You can leave it. In that case, you might actually want to use a property of once true inside of the scroll trigger, just to make sure that the scroll trigger is cleaned up when it's done. Once and
sorry.
Yeah. And so that would be an option. If you just wanted it to stay on the screen the whole time, that's a great thing. But if you want it to be entered, you don't want to have once true. Right. You want to have play. And then the second one would be when you leave the element or the scroll trigger, I guess. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to touch that one. When it re-enters, we want it to play again. So instead of just saying play, we actually want to say restart. Well, no, that would hide it again. So reverse, so that it goes backwards and re-shows the animation, re-shows the element instead.
So now, again, it's enter, leave, re-enter, re-leave.
You're right. Our words for them are enter, leave, enter back and leave back.
Okay, because relieve sounds like a relief, not like like relieve yourself elements. So
right.
Enter back, leave back.
Leave back.
You know what? That really sounds like there's some internal state machine going on in there, I have to say.
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically.
So reverse is not quite right. Would that be what we want on leave back, maybe?
Perhaps so, yeah.
Because it was hiding it instead of revealing it. So is it restart? Because restart.
Oh yeah, sorry. What my since you're
there we go. Okay, so, that's working.
My understanding of what was happening in the between was wrong, so that's why gotcha. I was thinking that you had it shown initially and then we're hiding it,
right?
Which that is not what we're doing.
So now I have to ask an interesting question. If I scroll really, really fast, I would think that GSAP would, make things enter really fast too, but it actually does a more sensible thing. And I don't know, are there some heuristics for like what happens if the user scrolls really fast?
Well, that's that scrub property, right?
Right. Yes. So if you had a scrub of true, then it would be exactly in line with what you were saying of the animation itself would go. You might skip it even if you're scrolling fast enough. But with this numerical scrub, it will animate to that progress value over time instead of being exactly in line with the scroll position.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, yeah, I think this is a pretty good little demo here.
Yeah, looks great.
I Wow. Yeah. Didn't even get to any of our important questions here or anything like that. Let's see. Do you have another 5 minutes for us, Zach?
Sure. I have time.
All right. So first of all, I think this is a very important question for you. What's your preferred animation library?
I wonder. No, I'm just kidding. GSAP is definitely the one that I use most. I think it is the most comprehensive, and I find it to be useful in most of my projects that I create. Just because it saves me so much time and it's so capable in what it can do. I can really get the job done, and that's a huge benefit. And so, yeah, GSAP. Not that I don't ever. I can't say that I've never used another animation library, but yeah, GSAP is definitely my go-to.
Fair enough. Yeah. So you pretty recently joined the GSAP team, right? In the past couple of years.
Yes. Yeah.
What were you doing? What were you doing before that?
Good question. So to give you some backstory for my development history, I started programming with any seriousness, you might say, my senior year of high school, when I was supposed to be in this online Chinese class, but it was way too hard for me. So I was like, I can't do this. I need to do something else. So
I'll pick up programming.
Yeah, exactly. I started with CSS animations, and really liked that I could see things happen immediately. Maybe that's my attention span being terrible, but that was a big plus for me. So yeah, started then, went to college at the University of Georgia, studied computer science, and that was helpful, but really not that helpful for web programming, and so a lot of my actual skill set was just me doing projects in my free time, or during class, and learning that way. So that's how I ended up like writing some CSS tricks articles, was just because I was like having fun trying things out, and building things that people hadn't made before. So then after that, after college, I actually worked in non-tech with college students for a couple of years, and then moved to tech full-time with GreenSock about a year and a half ago.
Awesome. Sounds like a dream job.
Yeah. GreenSock's a good company.
It's awesome. How many people are there? I can't imagine it being like 1,000-person company. Just
2,000.
2,000.
We have 2.
1,000? Wow.
Just two.
There's an individual person for each animation that runs on GSAP. They've got a little wheel that they turn.
Right. That's how they do it.
No, that's awesome. They're just two people maintaining all this documentation, all these great plugins,
and doing it full time. Honestly, that's the dream.
Yeah.
Hopefully, none of Microsoft's listening, but yeah.
Yeah. A couple notes with that. One, we're super thankful for our forum moderators. If you didn't know, GreenSock has super helpful and welcoming forums that anybody can post to about animation related questions for GSAP. So we have some moderators that volunteer their time and really help us out. So thank you to them, but also come join us. It's a lot of fun.
It's a quite good community you've built up there. A lot of people helping out and offering good advice there from what I've seen.
Yeah, it's unlike any other programming forums that I'm aware of. So that's one thing. I don't remember what the other thing was, so I'll have to get back to you.
Well, yeah, that's really cool. One more question. Any favorite web animations or techniques you've come across recently? Something that really wowed you?
So what I've been getting into more recently is like game dev type animation. Like obviously we can't on the web have all of the same rendering capabilities as dedicated game programmers can do, but especially like just learning or really being inspired, I guess might be a better word, by some like video game, especially shader techniques has been something that I've been casually learning more about. And so like, yeah, just trying to get more into kind of the shader WebGL type of world is something that I've been spending more time on recently.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really amazing. Like what video games are such a great inspiration for animation. They've just been doing so much and doing it for so long and doing it so performantly that
Right.
there's so many great things to learn from there. Yeah. All right. So let's see. Anything else you've got, David?
Second favorite animation. No, I'm kidding. I'm an ActionScript fan myself. No, I'm kidding. It is interesting to know that
GSAP is in ActionScript, so yeah.
Yeah. It evolved from ActionScript. I say evolved just because I think Flash was officially killed like maybe 1 or 2 months ago. So
Yeah.
I got my animation started in Flash, so yeah, fond memories.
Yeah, GSAP's been around for a long time now.
It's around 12 years at this point. So yeah,
history.
long time that Jack's been maintaining and updating it, and it's a whole lot better than it was then. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I think even David approves more of the new 3.0 setup of GSAP.
Good. I do.
And I remembered what I was going to say is the thing that allows Jack and I to continue doing the work that we do is the fact that like GSAP has some paid aspects of it. Like we are able to offer GSAP as a core product and a whole bunch of free plugins that are used literally on millions and millions of websites, because we are able to work on it full time, which with some open source projects, you might not have somebody full time maintaining it, and so not only has GSAP been maintained, but it's also been continued to be added to, because we do have some things that are behind some payment form. That also lets us provide that free support that we have in our forums, because I surely wouldn't be able to spend the majority of my workday, helping people for free in these forums if I was not compensated for being able to do that,
Yeah, Club GreenSock is definitely a really great thing, and it's a great way to support GSAP if you are a big fan of it. But it also unlocks a ton of plugins for you as well. So split text being among them, but the new scroll trigger stuff is free. Is that right?
Right. Yes. So usage wise, you're free to use GSAP on pretty much anywhere, as long as you're not using the club specific plugins like Morph SVG or Inertia plugin or something like that, except if you are using GSAP in a product that you're selling to multiple people. So like if you made a game with GSAP as your core engine and you're selling that to millions of people, you probably should pay us the business fee of the commercial license. So that's the only condition is if you're selling a product to multiple people that also uses GSAP.
Yeah, it's well worth it. The product itself is really great for web animation, and then the additional plugins that are unlocked from that are easily worth that. But yeah, if you're serious about animation on the web and do a lot of like client work, especially where timelines are fast and you're having to develop things quickly, the plugins available, the dev tools there, and the community around it is definitely a big advantage for it. There, I came from an agency before moving to CodePen. And GSAP was my go-to in all of that for building things out, because it just saved so much time, cross-browser stuff especially. But yeah, well that's pretty much it here, I think. Is there anything to summarize from this one? Anything you would pull from this as like a quick tip? there's a lot going on, so it's hard to hard to say. Yeah, I think
it's this syntax. If you're looking at it and you've never seen GSAP before, might look kind of confusing, you know. But then if you think about, okay, what exactly is this doing, and how, like, literally we have media queries built in, we have scrolling animations, we have these lines being split, we have a sequence of animations, like all of this different stuff. Then you think about it, okay, we're doing all of that in this lines of code. That might help you feel or understand, okay, it looks complex, but really it's quite simple compared to what we would have to do otherwise. And so if you're starting out, don't get overwhelmed by how long this is, or, oh, I don't remember the syntax or whatever. Like, the reason why I might be able to give you stuff off the top of my head is because I'm literally writing this all day, every day, you know? So don't be afraid. Start small. Start, okay, I want to do this certain thing. I want it to move in this way. How do I do that? And then, again, build on that and create the website that you want to build, piece by piece. So
yeah.
It's I guess the summary.
Well, the timeline approach really is great for just adding and building as you go. You don't have to have the full picture or the full setup in mind necessarily. You can
right.
Expand. So yeah, it's easy to start small and grow with that. Well, yeah, that's all the time we've got for today. We want to thank Zach so much for joining us. Thanks for your time and sharing all this knowledge on GSAP.
Thanks so much for having me.
And it
was fun.
Yeah, you can check out Zach and more of his stuff at zacsaucier.com. Saucier.
Saucier.
And you can check out GSAP or GreenSock, as it's known, at greensock.com. And yeah, so before we go, our show is supported by our sponsors. We've got CodePen at codepen.io and CSS-Tricks at css-tricks.com. And viewers like you can pledge at patreon.com/keyframers and subscribe to our channel for more great content. We've got links available below for our stuff and Zach and GreenSock as well, so definitely check those out. Before we go, any final words of wisdom, Zach?
Stay green.
Stay green.
Stay green. All right.
Dig it. Well, thanks everyone so much for watching. Until next time, adios, amigos.
Adios.